Hey, it's Bobby Cobb. Welcome to this edition of the Presence Posse. Joining me today is Dr. Fred Blum and Danielle McMahon, and we are going to be tackling the subject of presence and conflict.
No, we're not.
Beautiful. And with that, I'll turn it over to Fred and Danielle for some opening comments. We may have just gotten Fred's opening comment,
Yeah, I
Danielle.
think we did.
What do you think when the subject of presence and conflict comes to mind?
For me, I think this is very similar to Doc as well. I'm kind of conflict adverse. So it takes a little bit for me to stay present with conflict, whether it's within myself or whether it's within groups or within family. But I think it's particularly difficult when it's more emotionally charged.
Yeah, that's interesting. I study, at some depth, a model called the Enneagram, which is a 9-point personality model. And myself, as a type 9, the core of each type is like, what is it you want? What do you want to preserve? And so for type 9s, we want to preserve our peace. Peace and harmony become central. And so the unconscious influence of the type is anything that might want to pull me out of peace tends to be avoided, unless, of course, I can be present. And then I get to really we all know this, right? But you can't make a choice if you're not present. Then it's just you're automated, your programming kind of just doing its thing. But if I can get present, then I can think, okay, do I choose to be in this conflict? Yes, it may disrupt my peace. However, the outcome may be more important to me in this moment than the peace, whatever that might be.
So in that case, you're powering through, and you're saying the outcome is worth the discomfort.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it personally powering through, not to be super nitpicky, but it's like, to me, it's always like, transcend and include. So I include the hesitancy, the conflict, the desire to not be in conflict, and I try and transcend that to the possibility that maybe this is something that's important for me to engage with, if that makes sense. Powering through to me would be like I'm just going to ignore it and engage anyway in the conflict or whatever. I rather acknowledge that this is there, be present with my hesitancy, and step forward with that.
I did hear it like you were putting up boundaries and excluding things. So I appreciate the distinction, because what you're saying is pretty markedly different from that.
Yeah, language is funny. How do you know? You never know what other people hear.
Words are fun. And Danielle, I think I cut you off when I jumped so enthusiastically onto like a dog on a bone.
Yeah, I was going to ask what sort of those automatic avoidance mechanisms are. Like that, I understand from your explanation to Bobby that you're including that, right? Like you're not avoiding your feeling of avoidance, but you're stepping into that and then stepping into a choice. But for me, it's like, especially when it's family, when it's humans that I have a history with, like my automatic way to avoid that is just go do something else, right? Mm-hmm. Like just physically remove myself from the conflict. That's one of the first things that will pop into my mind as a way to deal with it. Do you have automatics like that?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do you every time remove yourself, or just sometimes
no.
you say?
No, right. Most of the time I don't anymore. because I am aware of it.
Yeah.
But, when it was just automatic and I wasn't as self-aware, I guess, as I am now, I would just like find myself in a different room, or I'm going to the barn, or I'm going to go do yard work, or take the dog out, or, any number of things, because that's my tendency, is to go do as opposed to be with that uncomfortable feeling.
Yeah. And of course, the title of this podcast is Presence and Conflict. Presence and conflict, not presence or conflict.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do we have both,
Yeah. And first, I think you have to be aware of those avoidant automatics. That
I feel like self-awareness has got to be the foundation.
Yeah.
Like everything we do.
I agree, because particularly, I mean, there's the potential for external conflict, but it seems like we're also pointing to an internal conflict.
Oh, yeah. Good.
Where we are recognizing, the situation. Hey, here's our family, and we'd like to be with family, but here's all of the landmines that have to do with family, and I better not talk about politics with this group, otherwise conflict is sure to arise. But there is also that internal conflict that you've got if you're, just doing something that you've never done before. I took a friend to meditate. We've got this group of nuns that are cloistered nuns, meaning they have taken a vow of separation and exclusion. They don't go outside. They live in a nunnery, and they basically pray. Their life is all about their one-to-one relationship with the divine. And I like to meditate with them. I don't talk to them. They're not meditating. They're praying. They're praying in Spanish because they're from Guadalajara, Mexico. So I don't understand what they're saying. But for me, just like being in that space is it just calms my heart. It brings about clarity. And I took a friend to it yesterday, and I had mentioned it to him a couple of times, and he'd like, oh, I'd like to do that sometimes. And he's 2 or 3 times he said, I'd like to do that. So we were having lunch, and he said, what do we do next? And I said, how about we go sit with the sisters? And he's like, oh, okay. And we had driven separately. We got there, and as we got out of the car, he's like, I'm a little nervous. And so we just kind of stood out in the parking lot, and I said, would you be interested in pulling on that thread? And he was totally game to do that. So I just started to ask him some questions. What are you thinking might happen as we go in there? What beliefs do you hold about that? And just a little bit of exploration. And there was no big aha moment that I perceived, but at some stage he just kind of looked up and smiled, and he goes, let's do this. Mm-hmm. And whatever it was, I didn't ask him about it, so I don't know the answer, but it appeared to just have disappeared. And I've enjoyed playing with conflict, both interpersonal, where if I'm holding on to a belief that is kind of irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, I'm like, all right, do it. Does it really matter that this person comes around to my way of thinking? And it's turned into recently a very interesting tool for self-discovery, to feel like I'm reaching the edge of my comfort zone here, and I'm about to go into uncharted territory. And am I okay with that? Am I okay with that? With whatever sense of anxiety is arising. Sometimes I like to pull on that thread. Other times I just kind of do what you suggest, Fred. It's just like, notice that it's there and welcome it and let it know it's okay. You're going to be with me, and you
could do both of them together. I mean, endless possibilities, I guess. This is cool though. This idea that, like, yeah, I love what you're saying about the inner and the outer conflict, that both are important to acknowledge. In fact, probably the more we resolve our inner conflict, the less outer conflicts we'll probably find ourselves in, although I wouldn't suggest that's a guarantee. Um, uh, just the idea that we can be present with our experience. This is the other thing I was thinking about. This idea that everything is a choice. Of course, as I said before, you've got to be at least somewhat present to be able to make that choice without your conditioning making it for you. But so, for example, my son called me yesterday to complain because someone asked if he could pick them up at the airport. And what they didn't tell him, they might not have known, was that where she wanted him to take her was over an hour away from the airport. And he called me after he dropped her off, and he was really pissed, and he felt like he got taken advantage of, and blah, blah, blah. And, I empathized with him. I didn't just want to go right into coaching mode or something. But afterwards, I was asking him, like, what choices did you perceive there? And his initial point was, I don't think I had any choice. Asked me. I said, well, let's look. Where do the choices exist? So, she says, "Oh, can you take me to Belton, which is about an hour, away from the airport?" I said, you made a choice. You made a choice to keep quiet and take her where she asked you to go, because in your mind, the alternative to that would you like to say, you know what, I'm not comfortable. This is further than I thought it would be, or to say, hey, can you throw in, $25 to cover my gas? You felt that was too awkward. Like you perceived that other choice was going to be too difficult or too awkward for you to make. And over the course of the next 10 or 15 minutes, we explored all these other possible choices that he could have made along the way, and how each one of them has an alternative. And whichever one you choose, it's because either that one feels much more important or the other one feels much too scary or whatever. And so with conflict, we can sit down. If we slow down enough, we can see, do I have a choice here? Or really not do I, but what are the choices? Do I want to engage in this conflict or not? What do I see as and some of this will happen almost instantaneously, but we could begin to slow down and notice that there are always reasons, like you're talking about stories, that inform either side. Whatever we choose, there's a reason that why we chose that. And if we can begin to see those reasons, they may not have as much power over us as we thought they did.
Yeah, I think just it seems like the simple recognition that you have more choices available to you takes away that feeling. And I've felt that feeling plenty of times, that I didn't have a choice, that, I had to do this. And if somebody wanted my conditioned response would be, no, I didn't want to do it, but I kind of had to do it, because of XYZ, whatever the rationalization or the story is. And just, going through that exercise with him of saying, hey, really look at how many choices you had seems to be freeing to me. What was how did he process that? What was his reaction?
He was fairly receptive to it. There was nothing to do with that at that moment, except just kind of listen and take it in. But hopefully it opens up a possibility. Maybe you have a choice that otherwise we're just victims, so what choice did I have? I had to take her to the airport or to Belton. Well, you did have choices, including saying, get out of my car and deal with the consequences of that. But he chose to not do any of that and just, be upset. But to realize that you choose that is much more powerful than just think you had no choice. And that was just, what else could I do?
Yeah.
You could always make a choice, even if, that the alternative, if she put a gun to his head and said, take me to Belton now, he could say, well, I had no choice. No, you could choose to say, pull the trigger, you know? So it's good to see that, I think. And especially in the realm of conflict, I think it's useful to see that.
Yeah. And it creates a sense of agency and a sense that you have a choice and that you're in control. And the moment that you come to the idea of, well, I don't have to do this, and this is going to be inconvenience and blah, 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 but it's a good friend and I'm doing a good deed. So
Exactly.
I'm
And then
okay
you could bring your whole heart to that, right?
Yeah.
This is my friend, and I'm doing this for them because blah blah blah. Now you're not in conflict. Then see, this is the inner conflict. Now you're not in the inner conflict because you're clear that you made that choice.
Wow, that's an interesting thread to pull, and I'm curious. I've not thought about this before. I don't know if you guys have. Does an inner conflict always precede an outer conflict? And can the fact that we're experiencing or witnessing an outer conflict, a perceived outer conflict, just be a pointing to say what's going on inside? You've got something going on inside of you that is in conflict that needs to be resolved.
I don't know if it always precedes it. It might follow it. So, for example, maybe there's no conflict until you come up to me and say, "Hey, would you pick me up at the airport?" And then that leads to some kind of inner conflict where I go, "Well, I was going to go with my friends, or was, you know what I mean?" And then I have to kind of question, what are my priorities, whatever. What do you
How's
think,
that hit you,
Danielle?
Danielle?
The thing that occurred to me as Fred was talking was, like, first he said he empathized with him and um, let him know that, yeah, I get it. I get how you feel, right? And then went through, there were choices you could have made for it not to land like he made the wrong choice, or for us, if we're doing our own inquiry on this, like, not to make ourselves wrong for the choice we already made, right? Like, we want to have options for future moments of conflict within us or without, outside of us, whatever, wherever the conflict first occurs to us. That we have those options, that we have choices. And I think without doing that kind of work, where you look back on a situation with some amount of grace for yourself and say, I could have done it differently. Not that I did it wrong, but, you know, by doing it that way, it brought these other things into the conversation, these other options, these other choices. And I think that that's a skill, that's a practice too, that we come to, that we can review a situation without the shoulda, coulda, wouldas, and all of the other things that we tend to do as humans in reviewing something that we didn't feel comfortable with or felt, yeah, you know, some kind of way, made it some kind of story in our brain, like we were taken advantage of.
That kind of reminds me of that story with the two monks walking through the woods, and they stop to help a woman cross the stream, and one of the monks picks the woman up and carries her across the stream and sets her down on the other side, and she goes off on her path. And in doing that, he violated a vow that he was never supposed to have physical contact with a member of the opposite sex. And they walk on, and 45 minutes later they get to this destination, and the other monk, who did not break his vow, starts chastising the one, saying, why did you do that? I can't believe, you know, this is a very clear, one of our most important precepts, and you violated it. And the first monk, who committed the quote unquote sin, says, you know, brother, I set that woman down 45 minutes ago. Why are you still carrying her? and you know, we do that often to ourselves when that internal conflict is going, because here's your son, he's already done the good deed, which he didn't really give himself credit for the good deed that he was doing, and all of the goodwill that maybe he banked with that person there. Instead, he's just kind of frustrated and talking to you, and we can do that. We beat ourselves up. Our inner critic just will oftentimes not let that go. And to me, that's just, again, it's a beautiful catalyst for inquiry, that when you
Yes.
recognize that that's happening, if that can be not like your rumble strip on the highway, the emotional superhighway, but that's like the giant jumbo pothole that is just jarring you into, like, boom, all right, something's going on. And I mean, to me, maybe it's just kind of where I am in my own exploration of all of this stuff. I just love having things for me to notice, kind of like, where is my conditioned frontier? Where is the end of my either map of the world or my comfort zone? Or, where do I have to wander before my bliss starts feeling a little threatened, my cultivated state of inner peace. And I really am enjoying kind of pushing that envelope. And in some cases, I just reaffirm, well, this is just how I am currently wired, and that's my conditioning, and that's who I am, and I'm okay with that. And then other times I'm like, oh wow, that's a total BS belief that I've bought into, that
Well,
doesn't apply at all in the real world. And where in the world?
and that's not me anymore.
Correct.
That's the beauty of it. And usually it's like when I work with clients and they have some kind of a breakthrough and they tell me, oh, this such and such happened. And, and I like to point out who they had to become. Like, that's the product of the work that they've been doing. That, because we think the breakthrough is in that moment that we, stand up in the conflict where we would have backed away in the past, and the breakthrough occurred in 1,000 little steps before that point, and then you're just not that person anymore. Like Bobby, you're saying, you just, sometimes, yes, I am still that person. Like you said, I'm wired this way, and that wiring still feels pretty real. And some, just until I notice it, until I realize in that moment, because I'm tested in some way, that's just not who I am anymore. The other thing that reminds me of is the story, really more of a joke, of the man that gets into an argument with his wife. And so he goes to his meditation room, and he's got this beautiful room with incense and candles burning and an altar. And he just sits on his meditation cushion, and for 20 minutes, he's at complete peace in the universe. And then he opens the door to his meditation room, and she's still there. This idea that, like you were kind of pointing to it, Bobby, can we bring our practice, whatever our practice may be, into the world, into our conflicts, into the areas that are not necessarily smack in the middle of our comfort zone,
and still be present.
And still be present, right?
Can you be present with the discomfort? Which,
Yep.
I guess that's kind of what I call the bliss technique. You call it something different, I think. I call your technique the bliss technique.
Oh, the thing. No, I'm going with that. I'm going with that. I like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, that exploration, to me, as I understand it, is really just an exercise in not even necessarily having to be comfortable with it. Just find out how you are. And
yeah, comfort's not comfort in that process is not the objective at all. It's just, can we be present, like so present with our experience that it opens, that it becomes something else. And I say it becomes a doorway into that much deeper, wiser part of ourselves, which tends to be more comfortable, but not by seeking comfort. Comfort usually means make the uncomfortable thing go away. And I actually
Yeah.
am suggesting that we move towards the uncomfortable thing rather than away from it. That's a whole other conversation, of course.
Yeah.
I have a
Yeah.
question. What would you guys like? How would you define conflict? What does that mean? While you're doing that, I have to plug in my computer because otherwise I'm going to have a different conflict.
Danielle, you want to tackle that one?
Well, when we were talking about conflict within ourselves, like I feel like there's another term for that, which is cognitive dissonance, right? So
Yeah.
anytime there's a dissonance, there's not a resonance. That's a conflict within ourselves, and when it's appears to be outside of us, it's more of a disagreement, right? We want to have an agreement. For instance, using the story that Fred was using, um, he agreed to pick this friend up from the airport, but he didn't know the whole thing. So he might not have agreed had he known that it was
Mm-hmm.
going to take 2 hours out of his day to pick her up from the airport, because he's taking her an hour away and bringing himself back that hour. He wasn't committed to that chunk of time. So there was a disagreement within him, but that was a lack of information. So I don't know that that was an external conflict. That was an internal conflict from not having the whole information. So the external conflict I think of more as just things are not what we agree with. It's a disagreement.
So, okay, external conflict is a disagreement, meaning, but there's like conflict has got like there's a little bit of this going on too, right? So it's not just that you and I have a different opinion; it's that you and I like there's some challenge that we're having different. I'm not saying this well, but it seems like more than just we don't agree.
I think the conflict may be the additional layer of that is, in that example, you both have to be very attached to your opinions for their a conflict. Because if we're all going out to dinner and I say, how do you guys feel about Mexican food tonight? And both of you say, no, not really. And I just say, oh, okay, well, how about Thai
That's
food?
not a conflict, right?
Yeah, that's not a conflict. The conflict arises when I feel very strongly about my way. And
Right.
on some level, I'm just wondering if this is an agreement and I'm thinking out loud. In order for there to be a conflict, does it need also to be important to me that you feel that way too? That it's not enough that you recognize I like ABC and you like XYZ.
I think two people have to be pulling in different
Yeah,
directions, and both are relatively committed to their position, whether it's an emotional position, I like Trump, you like Harris, whatever. See, if I say, oh, well, good for you, you should vote with your values. That's
yeah,
awesome, you know. But if I say, oh my God, how can you vote for her? Don't you, what's wrong with you? And then you go, well, how can you vote for that? Now we have a conflict. Now we're two people who think that the other person should be different, or their behavior should be different.
yeah,
And I think that's why it's more difficult for me to stay present to conflict in family, because then there is that piece, right? There is that emotional charge of I want to keep this relationship.
Well,
So
there's the choice again, right? Like this
right.
person. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
So I make that a priority, but do I make it a priority at the cost of standing in my own values?
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, so then again, it's an internal conflict.
And
It's
is there another choice? I mean, like sometimes no, and that's legit. But sometimes there might be a choice. Like, how can I approach them differently? How can I, you know, say I really want you to hear what I have to say? Whatever, you know what I mean? Like where it doesn't
yeah,
have to lose the
and I
relation.
do know that. I mean, some of what I'm thinking through is using the political example, right? There is a faction
Mm,
within my family, right? So generally speaking, we agree to disagree and we want to keep our relationship. So we do avoid it. But that's a choice we've all made through having several conflicts. We know where the lines are, where people are going to get emotionally involved and feelings are going to get hurt, right? Like we're just because we hold different opinions doesn't mean we can't love one another. So if you take that as them holding a different opinion as a rejection of your opinion, you take that as a rejection of yourself, that's a whole different thing, right? That's
mm,
becomes I have to defend myself and I have to, but I don't. I mean, I
right.
don't have to. Right? I have other choices in there. And I can also not sort of take the bait if it's offered. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the place where the history comes in. So I know that this is how this falls within my family. I know there are certain things within my um, relationship with my husband that we've been through a lot of times. So when that comes up, some conflict that we've been through comes up, I always have the choice. Am I going to base it on the history or am I going to stay present now?
Yeah.
What
I mean, that's the fundamental choice, isn't it?
now,
Right.
right?
I don't know if I say it's a choice, but like, am I going to just default to my programming or am I going to get in the present?
Right.
That's
And it like you said, that happens so quickly. Like you can just
yeah.
react, right? And it's that practice of taking that pause, of
It
slowing things
happens
down
less
a minute.
quickly as we develop self-awareness and all that stuff.
Really hard to pull the words back into your mouth, but if you can keep them from coming out, then you have an option, right? Then you have a choice. But
Mm,
And it's interesting. I mean, it's easy to see. You might get uh, like squishy kind of feelings with somebody that's super close to you that holds a certain political belief. And we'll just keep it on that topic, but keep it vague. And you can easily recognize, well, half the country has got more or
mhm.
less that same belief
yeah.
that they've got. And I'm perfectly fine with all of those people. But for some reason, a member of my immediate family having that opinion feels like a threat to me for some reason, or feels like a disrespect to me
Mm.
for some reason. So, to me, the more that we play around with this, and again, it just may be my current view of the world, I just see everything as being an invitation to go within and find out what needs do you have that are currently going unmet in this circumstance. That's one of the reasons that emotions arise with us. We've got something that we want very deeply and that we care for very deeply, and it's not going unmet. And we realize that this path that we're on, they're not going to go unmet. So as we come to understand that and we express that, that creates flexibility in our interpersonal relationships. And to the degree that we're able to go within and say, oh, well, that's a belief that I had, and I've had that for a long time, but it's really not working for me anymore. I've outgrown that particular box, or that belief structure, that worn out mental model, or that thought loop.
Yeah. And then do we want to rebuild it again? Like
Yeah.
that's, or do I want to squeeze myself into that structure? Like, those creatures that, like the sea creature, whatever they're called, that outgrow their shell, then they have to go find a new shell somewhere.
Yeah.
Or do you keep squeezing yourself into that little space?
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of people that really look forward to triggers. It sounds like, Bobby, you're at a spot where you really do, right? Like if I get triggered, and I think trigger's a good word because I always think of a hair trigger, like it happens that fast, then you always have that opportunity to find it within yourself. What about that triggered something in me? What got triggered, and what can I now make a choice on within my own belief system?
Yeah.
Right? Like that's something that people that really do love to expand and to question themselves and to experience life differently begin to look forward to, but most people not so much.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that I don't look forward to them. When they arise, I still kind of, I'm embarrassed, and I feel like,
Mm,
if like an angry comment is popping up in my head, I feel the need to edit that, and that's uncomfortable in the moment, and it's also useful to say, all right, what's going on in me? If these emotions that arise are truly an internal weather report, they're not telling me about my circumstances, what's going on the inside. And a lot of hypnotherapy, I mentioned this, Danielle, before you jumped on, Fred, a lot of hypnotherapy, we're working with a parts conflict
Mm-hmm.
that people have. Part of me knows that I should eat healthier and I should exercise more regularly, but part of me really loves watching YouTube videos and going down these wonderful exploratory rabbit holes. And there's a little bit of conflict there. So, the job is to figure out, well, what does this part want, and what does this part want, and what's the higher good that they both want? Because I think ultimately,
Hmm.
if you chunk up to a big enough level, you get to a point where they're not in conflict. And that's a lot of the stuff that every hypnotist and hypnotherapist does, is like talking to the part of you that wants to keep smoking because they like having the break and they like all of their friends out on the patio, and the part of you that recognizes you get out of breath now every time you have to climb 3 steps, and that's probably a good warning sign to be listening to.
Hmm.
And how do we get those parts to be not in conflict? How do we resolve that
Yeah.
conflict?
Right.
So it is useful.
Well, what I mean, I heard a lot in what you just said, but the part that sticks out for me is this idea that, like, we're making something wrong. If there's a conflict, I don't, is that 100%? I don't know, but I'm just going to suggest that in the majority of conflicts, we have to be making something wrong. Either it's something about ourselves, like the part that wants to smoke, the tendency is to make that part wrong. I'm not saying that's what you're saying, by the way, but normally it's that binary thing: bad smoker, good, climb the stairs. And that conflict that we may overcome. We may stop smoking because of that, and so you may say, well, that's a net positive, but it's not really transformation the way I would say. You
Yeah.
know,
No,
we're not
right.
really integrating those parts of ourselves. We're just overpowering them, and uh, it's funny. We were talking about welcoming conflict or triggers before. It's all relative, uh, but there's a part of me that does.
mhm.
And the caveat there is it's got to be at the right size that I can be just present without, you know, going unconscious or something. And I think it's possible that the size of the conflict, whether it's inner or outer, for me is growing, what I'm willing to actually get excited about, because I really do have this philosophy, and I can not prove this. I have no evidence of this. So it's just my choice of perspective on the world, that life is always giving us opportunities to wake up. That's really all it's doing. So that conflict, and specifically what it triggers in me, and I like the body, so I go right into the somatic aspect of it. That's information. It's valuable for me to be able to integrate this. And I could go into all the whys, but the bottom line is, it's an opportunity when that conflict comes. If I can be present with, like, the stuck part of me that thinks life has to be a certain way, or that people have to be whatever, uh, and I can soften that, and I can make space for them, I think that's a pretty huge outcome from what looks like a problem when it first happens. So sometimes it's just a question of framing it. So do I have to make that person wrong just because they see, they're voting for Trump and I'm voting for Harris? Or do I have to make myself wrong because um, somebody spoke to me and I wanted to rip their head off because I didn't like their tone of voice or something? Uh, can I notice that part of me and be compassionate and kind to that part of me? Because it is a part of me. And maybe that part has, really positive intention, even if it is, going about it in a way that might be destructive. So it's just good, I think, to be able to create that space where we can create space for all the different aspects of our being.
Yeah. If you were saying that, I was reminded of, like, early, anybody who has ever studied neuro linguistic programming, NLP. Um, One of the very first things that you learn is a substitution of the words good versus bad to
Right.
and replace that with useful or not useful, as it involves with your uh, some of your belief systems and your conditioned ideas, and just looking at that. And a good example of that is that belief that you started with, that I have a belief, and the way that you stated it was so elegant and beautiful. I have no idea if it's right or wrong, but it's working
Mm.
for me right now, that everything in life is one extended invitation to go within and to explore our true nature. And I know I didn't quote you there. I gave you the Cobber version of that, but I think it's the same sentiment. And making that shift of, if we see something as good, then we want to hang on to it. If we see something as useful or non-useful, our attachment to that, it's a lot easier to say, well, that was a very useful belief for me for a very long time, and it served me well. But now it's just hampering me and
Mm-hmm.
it's not serving me at all anymore. It makes it a lot easier to jettison that belief and to create room for either a new belief or a new lack of belief around that particular topic. Either one of those might show up or not.
Well, yeah, there may be an element of judgment in conflict, or there may be an element of that that is me. That's part of me. Like, I was listening to something the other day about college students who were offered to buy coffee cups. So how much would you pay for this coffee cup? They said $3. We paid $3, get a coffee cup. And then 2 weeks later, they came back to them and said, how much would you sell your coffee cup for? And they said 5 or 6, or because the difference was it was a coffee cup and now it's their coffee cup. So it becomes part of their possessions, part of them in a sense, right? Like, it is more valuable because it's mine than just right? Like there's an opinion out there, doesn't belong to me. I don't care that much about it. But if it's my opinion, then it's a whole different thing. So that
Yeah.
I don't know that that's the same as judgment, but it's more of an ownership or identifying with it, right?
Feels like at the very least it's a key ingredient.
Yeah. Adds to the charge of it. Like I wouldn't be emotional about it if it wasn't something that, yeah, had served me well in the past, was useful for me in the past. It may not be useful in this moment or going forward. And still, because it's mine and because it's worked for me, it's a little harder to just not defend, not get into a conflict over.
And then there's just the good old ego, that like, has a certain structure that this is me. And, those like the ego is like a wall that we build around our identity. And so it's like the higher, the stronger those walls, it's like those beliefs are less and less open for consideration. This is who I am. This is what I believe. And so if you say something that is in conflict with that or do something in conflict with that, I'm going to have a problem with it because it feels like an attack on me.
Right.
This is, this topic is so timely given that we have a big election in the US. At least some people would say it's a big election in 3 weeks or so. And, somehow, I think social media is a big part of this. People have tied their political beliefs so deeply to their identity that we no longer can even regard people that have different beliefs as, decent human beings anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, to my mind, that's all ego. And very often the ego will cloak itself in virtue and say, well, I believe this, but, because it makes me such a good person. And anyone who doesn't believe that, obviously, it isn't like as advanced morally or spiritually as I must be. And
yeah, and I think that has also gotten woven in there, right? Like it's not just the political, but
oh yeah,
the religious ramifications of your political affiliation. And oh my goodness. So yeah, I do think that it's important to understand that none of that defines who we are as human beings, and be able to allow people to hold their own belief system without incriminating them over it, and without um, sacrificing our peace. I'm probably right there with you in the Enneagram. Pretty sure that for me, that's what's important is that we can move forward, right? We can continue to grow and evolve and have relationships with one another and not like destroy ourselves.
I think not destroying ourselves would be a nice bonus. I just think it's important, like, when we talk about these beliefs don't define us, I just want to throw in that, like the essence of who we are. And this is beyond human beings, because human being, like that in itself is a secondary or whatever. Who we are at our truest, that spark of divinity, whatever you want to call it, is indefinable. And so anytime we add definitions, I am this, I am that, I believe this, we're already stepping away from the truth of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes I think it's, I mean, this is sort of my approach in general, is we start with that. We return to the truth of who we are. And then from there, as we become more grounded in that, we'll see what beliefs still even hang around, which ones, are somehow, more compelling than the peace and the clarity and the freedom of who we really are.
Yeah, and once you've experienced that, it's hard to imagine that you can get pulled back into being human, but you sure do.
I know, isn't that funny? Like in the moment that we're in peace, but for as long as it lasts, I
It's
I
like
remember this is just a funny example. This is quite a few, more than 20 years ago, and I'd had a moment of just real clarity, and it lasted for a little while where like the whole world just was at peace with me. And uh, I remember sitting with a friend who was not sharing this moment of clarity with me in that time. And literally tears are streaming down my face because I'm looking at my friend just like another human being. And the thought that kept coming through my mind, I was speaking it, was, what was I so afraid of?
mm,
Like just this fear of other human beings, that they're going to judge me or they're going to reject me or whatever it was. And in that moment, it seemed so absurd that such a fear could exist. It did manage to return,
yeah,
to
dang it.
Daniel's point, but it's still, I think that there's always a little more space after some whatever moment like that, but yeah, I love what you said. It's like it seems like, boy, I'll never go back to that old way of fear and conflict, and yet somehow I find my way.
hmm Yes, it's very prevalent and very easy to kind of snap back, right? And that's, I think, part of why we're doing what we're doing. People have to have inputs where other things are possible. As humans, right? We can recognize our divinity and still function as humans. Like we can function as a divine human. Is that a thing? I
I
think it
think it
is.
is a thing. I mean, I don't know the language or not, but just having, to me, it's like the ego is like a mask that, to whatever extent, uh, is opaque to the divinity, to the light and the love and the
Mm,
freedom and the peace of who we already are. So, all of this work we're talking about is about the ego becoming thinner so that divinity just shines through.
mhm.
You're still going to be a human being. You'll still be Danielle and Bobby and Fred, but um, just less attachment to that,
Yeah.
less attachment to this idea of a me and a you as separate from me. The moment I think that there's a me and a you, like the seeds of conflict have already been planted, you know?
Yeah, so maybe that's part of the definition of conflict is you have to see other.
Mhm. There's an other. Brilliant. Yes.
Yeah, that's step one.
Yeah. And so the more I live in some degree of oneness, where, okay, I'll take it for granted. Like if we look at the screen, that there's a box that looks like Bobby, and that looks like a separate box from Danielle and a separate box from Fred. Okay, that's cool. I get that. And as human beings, it's probably useful to
It
live in
is.
this world. But then I can also remember that what we share, like the background behind these boxes, we'll call it the screen, that these images all emanate from one source, from one screen. And so I'll acknowledge, these three separate identities on the screen, but I'll know that there's something beyond that we all share. And that just creates the space for me to not have to defend as though my viewpoint were separate from the expression of me as Bobby or Danielle. I don't have to make such a big deal about it now because I realize it's all one anyway. There's not really as much separateness as my ego would have me believe.
Yeah, I like that. So almost sometimes I'll play around with the idea. There are times that I very much identify with my body as myself, and even though I've got a deep intellectual understanding that that's not the case. I have an intellectual understanding that that's just I've been conditioned to believe that. Nevertheless, I'm sometimes very identified with that, and other times I'm not. I'm very identified with just the wide open, infinite, and eternal awareness. And I I kind of think of it as the theater of my imagination. And I use that screen analogy that you just did, Fred, that, you know, I am the screen on which it is appearing.
Mhm.
I am the light that is making the
The movie.
projection
Right.
possible, and I am the conditioned thoughts and belief that are creating the story. That's all me. And sometimes I get lost in the story. Other times I sit back and I recognize that I'm the producer of this divine piece of work that is being out there, and that's just a different perspective. And with one, there is a lot more attachment to the conditioned beliefs, and with the other, you know, those are just like waves that are arising in the ocean, and they don't mean anything. But I personally go back and forth between those. I imagine that I don't check in enough to know, but I imagine that I'm oscillating into and out of that all day, every day. You know, it's just,
Yeah. Where did I just see this? Oh, it was a Zach Bush video that we oscillate something. I forget how he describes it, but we blink in and out of existence 1,000,000 times a second. So maybe even more than a few times a day. We go in
yeah,
and
I'm
out.
sure. Yeah,
You know?
yeah. The limiting factor is how often am I checking in to see?
Right.
And
Yeah,
that's just two possible identities of you, right? Like you can
yeah, yeah.
identify yourself as body, but you can also
Good
identify
point.
yourself
Yeah,
as your thinking or your emotions, or, you know, and we talk about them like they're all separate, and they're not separate, but we experience them that way sometimes. So it is that same internal, external thing, right?
Yeah.
If we see ourselves as these separate pieces, then we're going to see others as separate from us. And the more that we can bring that all into one experience, the more I think
It's
we
11
can
hours.
begin to see that outside of ourselves as well.
Hmm. Guys, I
well,
think we're reaching that moment.
Yeah, we
yeah,
get yelled at.
yeah, we're getting there. So actually, what I'd like to ask you guys to do is accomplish two things with your final thought. Number one, give us your final thoughts on this particular subject and how is it showing up for you right now. And two, just how do people get more in contact with you? And is there any particular offer that you would like people to be aware of?
Okay,
Danielle?
I'll start. So I have a workshop this weekend in person at my farm. If you're local, reach out to me on Facebook, which is the best place to find me. My page is public. You can message me. That
What's
workshop is from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. and it is called Rediscovering Peace Through the Ancient Wisdom of Seasonal Living.
oh,
So we are trying to provide, you know, tools for peace as we come up on what we suspect may be a rather disruptive season between politics and family and holidays and winter in the northern
hmm.
hemisphere here and the northern part of the northern hemisphere. So yeah, that's how to get
Yeah.
a hold of me. As far as um, a final comment, I think I'll go with the one I just gave. Yeah. The more you're integrated within, the more you will begin to live in more harmony and less conflict without.
Excellent. Thank you, Danielle and Fred.
Mhm.
Final thoughts?
Final comments. Yeah, I mean, the what comes to me is something that is like we've spoken about it several times tonight today, is that uh, conflict can be a gift if we choose to approach it with presence. And if you don't see it as a gift, try seeing it as a gift that you don't see it as a gift. And you that's kind of a turtles all the way down sort of thing there, but it's just some place to play. Uh, I do. It looks like so. I am doing something new, which is I've created a group for just it's going to be a coaching group. I still don't have a better name than coaching group, but I'm going to try and come up with something. And it's limited to 6 people. I know we have 4 in it right now, and at least a couple of others that are interested, if not immediately in the near future, because it's going to be no commitment. People can come and go monthly. Uh, but the nature of this group will be based on the 2 primary pillars of my work, which are realization, waking up to who we really are, and creation, which is, once you know who you are and you know that your nature is peace and clarity and happiness, you don't have to seek it in the world. What kind of life do you want to create? So creating lives that we love on the foundation of peace and clarity and freedom. Those are the 2 pillars. And they're going to be, it'll be met is it bi-monthly? Whatever twice a month means. We'll be meeting twice a month for 90 minutes, and it'll involve teaching various principles about realization of creation, space for coaching for any individuals that would like to receive coaching. And the third part, which maybe I'm most excited about, is the idea of group energy, that when we all come together with a particular intent to, especially the intention of waking up to our true nature, there's a tremendous, I believe, exponential energy that gets generated. And we're going to be playing with using that energy to literally fuel our creations, so that the energy that we generate from, tapping into our true self then becomes available to sort of, I think of it like a carrier that carries that intention, that choice, as I call them, up into the matrix of the universe, so that we can begin to be more powerful as creators. So if anybody out there is listening, you can email me at the email address on the screen. You can find me on Facebook. We'll see if any of those spots are still available.
And there was a wonderful moment as you were doing that Danielle just did this.
It warmed my heart.
Yeah. And I felt the same thing. I just thought that was such a beautiful expression of your work, and just a cool way to think about the way that we're making our ways through the world. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
My name is Bobby Cobb. You can reach me also on Facebook or on any of the little ways that are going to be scrolling.
Change your name on the bottom.
He's working on it. There
you go. I'm an MC in training. I'm under the tutelage of Miriam Siegel. She's such an artist at doing this.
How you doing? We miss you, Miriam.
Yeah, we do miss you, Miriam. She's working on supervision this particular week. My final thought on conflict is just that it can be another way of looking at it, not necessarily as a gift. You can think of it as a tool, just as a tool to interrupt your reactive conditioning way that many of us go through life, and use it as a tool, as a catalyst to just create a little bit of space, a little bit of clarity, and a little bit of silence in your life, enough to just start asking a question. And the best question is, what's going on here? Why am I wrestling with this, the way that life is unfolding for me right now? And if 10 people ask that question, odds are good we'll get back 10 unique answers, but it's about the answer that comes back for you. And I think our conditioning is so pervasive and so profound that one of the hardest things about this journey into presence is getting some sort of an interrupt in your patterns that are unfolding, that we've been conditioned to react to, and just create the room for response and for contemplation and for inquiry. And if you're interested in exploring that with me, there's a group on Facebook called Our Mindful Life, and this conversation continues there all throughout the week. So thank you guys both for the generosity of your time and attention and presence. And thank everybody for watching, both those that watched us live as well as those that are watching us on the replay. We appreciate you. And we will be back next week with another subject. We don't know what it is yet.
Yet to be determined.
Yeah, to be determined. We
Presence
live
and
in the
uncertainty.
moment. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. So ciao for now, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.